Okay, so this morning, I'd like to have you imagine, but I think you could just look outside, a really sunny day. No clouds in the sky, just like today. And imagine your chubby little 2.5-year-old running up to you and saying, Mom, can I have a bowl? And you go, what do you need a bowl for? And he goes, hail. And you're like, bowl, sunny day. I'll invite you into the world of a mum of 3 under 3. When a child asks you for something, it is faster to just give it to them than try to reason with them, so that's what I did, right? Here, Nathan, here's your bowl. So Nathan takes his bowl, and part of our family-like thing was that if it did hail, we'd put a bowl out to catch it, right? Because then we could look at the hail. And so you can imagine my absolute horror/amazement when 2 minutes after the bowl got put out, hail started coming from the sky. God spoke a lot to our little Nathan in those days, most of the time to speak to us. And that's the thing, right? Throughout Scripture and throughout history, we will see hail bowl moments of faith. Actions that are precipitated, by God's direction alone, right? Noah, get an ark ready. It's a really big hail bowl. Abraham, leave your family. I'm not going to tell you any more details than that about where you're going, but hail bowl moment. Today, we're going to be looking at something that is faith that looks a little bit different. So not a hail bowl, it's more like a case board. So we're in Hebrews 11, and that's where we've been. And so we're going to look right at verse 1 and 2, and then we're going to jump straight to verse 8. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It's the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in the days of old earned a good reputation. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to a land that he would give him as his inheritance. I've just started my timer. He went without knowing where he was going, and even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. Hail bowl, right? It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise, and so a whole nation came from this one man who was good as dead. Isn't that great? I feel so old, I'm as good as dead. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashores, there is no way to count them. So this is where different translations, or even going back to the Greek, is quite helpful. In my NLT, it says she believed, right? But really, the better translation is, maybe you've got in your ESV or an NASB, is actually she considered him faithful who had promised. She considered him faithful who had promised. So instead of believe, the original Greek leads us to this picture of someone considering, weighing up facts, someone looking at the evidence. And so Sarah, we find, is less of a hail bowl girl and more of a case board girl. Okay? So this morning, we're going to take some time looking at what is this evidence that she considered? What did she weigh up in order to find him faithful who had promised? And so that's what our agenda is. Before we get there, I feel like every person who's taught on like Hebrews 11 does the whole, well, when Paul said, who would you like to preach to about from Hebrews 11? I thought, for me, I looked at the list and I thought, Sarah. Because I could not for the life of me figure out why she was on this list. All my rememberings of the story of Sarah kind of led me to she was victim of self-preservation of her husband or dodgy dealings with a servant girl. None of it kind of screamed pillar of faith. And so I did what any sane person would do, and I chose her, right? Because I thought, actually, I need to take a deep dive into Genesis and the story of Abraham and kind of figure out, why is she on this list? And so Sarah was 127 years old when she died. And the thing is, Genesis has an author. Like any other book of the Bible, Genesis has an author. And that author is detailing things that happened, so they're historical, but he's also including things for a reason. And so if she's 127 years old when she dies, and we only have like 3 or 4 main stories that include her, clearly it's not her whole life. And when you study Genesis, you see this pattern that this author is purposely creating, and it's almost like a song, right? So you know when we sing in our songs and we have like the verse, the chorus, the bridge, you go back to the verse, back to the chorus, then depending on who's leading, how many times you do the bridge, right? And likewise, the author here is creating a song, so you almost know what's next in the story. And the Bible Classroom says that Genesis 1 through 11 walks us through this thematic cycle of creation, escalating failure, decreation, and finally there's a recreation of a remnant that is commissioned as a new humanity. And you can see it, right? Eden, creation, and then the fall, and then, the brothers, and then Lamech, and then you see the decreation of the flood and the recreation of this remnant that would be a new humanity and Noah, and then it continues. And the story of Abram and Abraham, because they're one and the same. So all morning long I'm going to be saying Sarah, I don't know, right? The story of Abraham has this cycle that actually happens multiple times of this creation, escalating failures, decreation, and then this remnant or this new creation, okay? And so this gives me a little bit of sympathy for Sarah because we're not getting an overview of her whole life. We're not getting like her highlights and her lowlights. A lot of the time she is in the cycle bit of the escalating failures. And so we're seeing how she fits into a melody that is predominantly following her husband's life. Okay, so our case board. We first encounter Sarah in Genesis 11, and it's in Terah's line of his descendants, right? And we find that she is married to Abram. Her name is Sarai. And what we have in verse 30 is a description. But Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children. Now, being unable to have kids back in that time was extremely difficult. Remember that Eden blessing of be fruitful, multiply? To have the inability to do that was massive. And today it's the same, isn't it? It's still like anyone who is struggling to have children who wants them, there's turmoil and there's heartbreak, even within a culture where that is not what defines a woman, is her ability to have children. And so right from the intro, we find that she's described by her inability to have kids, and that's not an easy thing to be identified by. Then in chapter 12 of Genesis, we get to a promise that is made to Abram. And the promise says that he will go into this land just like Hebrews 11 said. And God says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. And I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on the earth will be blessed through you. And so we have this promise to Abram, Sarai's husband, that is directly related to having children. But remember, Sarai can't have children. And so this promise that's directly related to it can create like a heavy weight, right? So you think about your own desires to have children, and then God appearing to your husband and saying, you can have many kids, and you go in, but I can't. And so we come to our first kind of escalating failure, not the first one in this cycle, but the first one we're going to look at. And so in verse 10 of chapter 12, we find that Abram and Sarai, there's a famine, and so they go to Egypt. And as every good husband would, Abram tells his wife, look, you're really beautiful. I actually think that guys are going to look at you and think, that's his wife, and they'll kill me so they can have you. So if you can just pretend to be my sister. How valuable do you think she felt? And that's what she did. She was faithful to her husband. And so just as expected, Pharaoh's people kind of get word that there's this gorgeous 60-something-year-old, right? This is the ages we're talking about. And so they send for her, and Pharaoh takes her into his kingdom. And so Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her, sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord sent terrible plagues upon Pharaoh. There we go. And his whole household because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and accused him sharply. "What have you done to me?" he demanded. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister and allow me to take her as my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and get out of here." Pharaoh ordered some of his men to escort them and sent Abram out of the country along with his wife and his possessions. Can I just draw your attention? What have you done to me? The Hebrew for that is mazothasa. What have you done? Do you remember anyone else who said, "What have you done?" It's the exact words that God uses in Genesis 3. And this is another one of those patterns that we see. Guys, you know when you have opportunity to dive deep into the Word, there is so much cool stuff. And the more I study the Word, the more I'm just blown away by how much detail there is that makes you just look at God and go, "You are so creative." Any literature people in here? The themes that run through the Bible, it's just crazy, right? And so this is another example of one of those intricate patterns that the author is creating that draws us back to Genesis. So in many of the stories, you will find real characters, but they're also playing a role. You have an Adam and Eve character. You have a deceiver character like the snake. You have something that looks good, right? That someone wants. And you even have a righteous or a God character. And in this story, what is the beautiful fruit that was pleasant to look at that shouldn't have been touched? It was Sarah. And in this story, Abram is the deceiver, right? He's the one who is whispering lies about who Sarah is. And it's actually the Pharaoh who's declaring, "Mazothasa, what have you done?" God's chosen ones are not always the good guys. And I think that is often the case. And it's a biblical fact that you need to understand, because otherwise, when you read these stories and you think "Oh, these are God's chosen ones, so therefore God must approve of what they're doing," that's going to lead you to a really unsettled place. God is not approving of what they're doing. He chose them not because they were good. He chose them out of his grace. And for lots of us who have this perception that God's grace started when Jesus came, no, he's always been grace-filled. And it's out of their chosenness that they are called to something greater. Guys, that stands for us today. He didn't choose you because you were blameless. He chose you because of his grace and his love. But now that you are chosen, you have a choice. Are you going to trust him, or are you going to scheme? And sometimes these, especially if you've been a Christian for a long time, these stories in the Old Testament become so familiar that we kind of lose the reality of what's going on here. And I think sometimes you can even come from a church background where you're kind of pressured to think these stories are okay. They're all really lovely, but they're not. This guy hands his wife over to Pharaoh in order to preserve himself. They might kill me, so just pretend. Let them take you. And honestly, this has always gotten my justice button right? Because Abram is acting so cowardly here, and yet, what happens? Essentially, he's blessed by doing it. All the stuff Pharaoh gives him, he takes out of Egypt. I mean, draw your eye back to verse 16 here. Then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Male and female servants. This is where Hagar, who we'll encounter later, enters the scene. She is part of the reward that Abram gets for lying to Pharaoh and putting self-preservation above everyone else in the scenario. Now here's the deal. Justice button, right? So on Second Tuesday, we had some time at the beginning where we were praying, and we had these lovely little handouts that had characteristics of God. And so we were just praying through, Holy Spirit, are there anything when it comes to the Father that I look at and I think that doesn't actually reside as true for me? And for most of us, we did the whole thing of yep, yeah, I'm good. And then you're like, oh, there's still so much time. So, all right, Holy Spirit, shall we have a conversation about this? And for me, the first one was God is faithful and unchanging. And I was like, of course. But as I was reading through each verse, I came to Deuteronomy 32:4 that said, all his ways are just. Ooh, the Holy Spirit got me. Because literally on Tuesday, I typed that thing. This really gets on my justice button, right? And so I was really struck by the fact that, and humbled by the fact that I was clearly saying, my justice is better than God's justice. I would have done things differently. But then what the Holy Spirit revealed to me as well is that my understanding of blessing is different than God's understanding of blessing and what he communicates to us. So I looked at that and I was like, well, that's blessing, isn't it? It's stuff. Stuff is blessing. And God really spoke to my heart about the fact that actually, we go right back to Garden of Eden, the blessing that he gives is go be fruitful and multiply, and it's relationship with him, right? And so my interpretation of blessing then distorted my interpretation of justice. Does that make sense? And so actually, what I viewed as blessing is actually a consequence here of Abram's lying. And part of the outworking of that consequence is that he has Hagar now in his household, who later will come to be not a blessing, but quite a fly in the ointment of his marriage, his family. And so I was just really humbled by that, and that's my little, sometimes we need to remember to look at things through the lens that the Bible provides us, and not the lens of our own kind of stuff and our culture around us. And so blessing in this doesn't necessarily look like stuff. So back to our case board. We know she's beautiful, so much that Abram thinks he'll get killed because of her. So dodgy dealings with the Pharaoh. And then we have in verse 17 this beautiful moment where it says, but the Lord. So even when her husband doesn't protect her, the Lord sends plagues upon Pharaoh's house to deal with this situation so that she is protected. And in chapter 15, verse 5, we've got God making a covenant with Abraham. And in the covenant, again, he reiterates this thing about descendants. And so he says, look up to the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And then in verse 6, you have, and Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. And so the righteousness that Abram has here is the right relationship with God. It's because he got to the point where God said, this is what I'm going to do. And Abraham went, all right, I believe it. And this is so important because God declares as righteous, not the one who conquers armies or builds cities in their own name, but the one who ceases scheming and trusts the impossible. That's the person in right relationship with God. So the issue here is not Abraham having the fruition of this massive nation. The righteousness that we are hearing about is his right relationship with God because he trusts him. And so, just as quickly as Abraham trusts the Lord, clearly this promise being reiterated weighs really heavy on Sarah. And so she comes up with her own scheme of how God's promise is going to come to pass. And so in chapter 16, we have, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. It's funny, isn't it? God never said he'd prevented her. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, listened to this language, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to her husband, right? Gave her to Abram. What does that sound like? She took the fruit and she gave it to her husband. And then Abram ate the fruit, right? He had sexual relations with Hagar and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt. So we've got a servant girl who's been given to Abram, and it's all with this idea that this promise is going to be fulfilled. And this language, again, of revisiting the fall, where we've got the fruit being taken, something that is not yours, and being given. And can I make this really, really clear? If God has promised you something, whatever you feel that God has promised you, he will not ask you to do something that then compromises righteousness in order to get it. So if you feel like God has promised you a job, he is not going to ask you to lie on your CV to get it. If God has promised you whatever it is, fill in the blank, he's not going to ask you to sin in order to get it. And I feel like that's something that just needs to be stated really clearly. Whatever you feel like God has promised you, you do not have to forfeit righteousness in order to get it. So, then we've got Sarai has been mistreated by Abram. The consequence of that was many gifts, including Hagar, and now Sarai is mistreating Hagar. And so then she said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show you who's right or who's wrong, you or me," right? All of a sudden, there's this conflict that's created by these decisions, the scheming. Abram replies, "Look, she's your servant, so you deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. This language again of when in the garden, when Adam says to God, "It's the woman you gave me," right? This I'm not going to take responsibility for my actions. Sarai is not taking responsibility for the decisions she's made. Abram's not taking responsibility for the decisions he's made. And Hagar is caught in the middle of this. And what happens in between here, so Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. And Hagar runs away, and you know what? God meets with her. And in his kindness, he blesses her. And the thing is, this whole situation and the idea that these real Christian stories, right, shouldn't rile us or get us angry, that's ludicrous. We should feel the weight of the injustice here. And the author hasn't glossed over these failures of God's chosen ones. In fact, it's part of the point that he's making. This cycle of failures, right? Creation, escalating failures. And so it should create a guttural response in us. It should make us go, "This isn't okay." And so Hagar runs away into the wilderness, and despite Hagar not being God's chosen one, God shows her mercy and promises to bless her with more descendants than she can count. And God blesses her because that is who he is. And so in the midst of God's people acting really not nicely, Bible Project says he doesn't undo what these people did. They're his partners. He's going to let their choices create the consequences that they do because God's got a thing about letting humans rule the world together. And if we make a mess of it, he lets us. And so he won't undo, but what he will do is meet people where they're at and plan for what evil has been done to transform it into blessing. And that's what this scene is about here. Actually, they're making really bad decisions, but God is going to use it for blessing. So this mini cycle then ends with the decreation and the recreation of Hagar. But not only Hagar, Abram is turned into Abraham. He's renamed. Sarai is renamed as Sarah. And in this, we find out now that the blessing and the promise is reiterated. And we find out that Sarah is 90 years old, right? So this is where we are in the story. She's now 90. This promise has been made really clear. This is about Sarah. Sarah is the one that's going to be the one they bring as a descendant. And Abram even goes, "You know what? I'm quite old, right? So could it just be Ishmael? He's already around. Could it just be Ishmael?" And God's like, "No, it's Sarah. It's always been Sarah." And so this promise has always been about her being the one that this covenant descendant comes through. Then in chapter 18, we get this moment where God appears to Abraham with two other people. We don't know who they are. They don't name the angels or whatever. So he's with three of them come, and one of them's the Lord. And Abram invites them to come and eat with him. And then he runs to Sarah and is like, go get 3 measures of flour, right? This is 8 to 9 bags of flour. So you're talking about, I can make 26 loaves with that. It seems a bit excessive, doesn't it? And then while they're eating, the visitors asked, where is Sarah, your wife? And Abram's like, she's in the tent. Then one of them said, I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abram and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure? The word here is Eden, especially when my master, my husband, is also old. Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, can an old woman like me have a baby? And this is the most gorgeous sentence in this whole thing, right? Is anything too hard for the Lord? If you take nothing else away from this morning, can we just say that together? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And so the next time that you guys are having a chat and you're like, I don't know how this is going to work out, I want the one of you to respond, is anything too hard for the Lord? Right? It's just beautiful truth. We've got a 90-year-old who's promised to have a baby. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she hid in the garden. No, so she denied it, saying, I did not laugh. And then I love, we talk about this all the time. But the Lord said, no, you did laugh. And that's how it kind of ends. It's this funny interaction, isn't it? I didn't laugh. No, you did laugh. Right? And so we've got this beautiful thing. And it's funny because, again, on Second Tuesday, right, we had this moment where we were praying about big things. And Paul was like, pray about big things. Go, big. Think about this area of Merthyr being a paradise. And one of our friends went, and he, it wasn't it was not like he considered it. It was just it's just what comes out, isn't it? And so even with Sarah here, when God says you're going to have a child and you're 90, there's going to be a moment where you go, and you don't even have a moment to kind of it's just where you're at. It's so ridiculous, isn't it? And so our friend wasn't being not trusting God for this area of Merthyr. It was just that natural response that that's so big. Can I ever imagine that area being a paradise? And then we get to chapter 20. And I have chapter 20 up here really big because I feel like if I don't have it up here, all y'all are going to think I just mixed up my notes. Because I think it was probably when I was an adult and we started doing the whole, it's really good to read through a whole book and not just pull chapters, that I realized he did it twice. Abraham twice gave his wife to someone else. And if you don't read the book through, you can be like, I thought it was Pharaoh. I guess it was King Abimelech. But no, he did it twice. Yes, he clearly learned nothing from the first time. And the predicament it later created for his marriage and ultimately the whole world, right? Because Ishmael grows and is blessed, and in his descendants, we find the root of Islam. And so here he is. And Sarah must have been an absolute bombshell, because at 90, there's still kings going, yeah, I'd like her. King Abimelech takes Sarah, and once again, God steps in where her husband doesn't. And so in chapter 20, we find that it is God who tells King Abimelech in a dream, Don't touch her or you'll die. Like, he's really clear with him. And then I love how in the dream, like there's this, in the dream, God responds. In the dream, King Abimelech, right? So the narrator is letting you know that he's having this whole dialogue in his dream. And he's like, I didn't touch her. And God's like, yeah, because I didn't let you. And so there's clearly something going on with King Abimelech's family, because he says, ask Abraham to pray for you, and you'll be healed. And so again, here we have not the chosen one being upright, but the non-chosen one, the king. And so not only does God rescue Sarah, but the king makes sure that everyone knows she didn't do anything wrong and that her reputation is clear. And then what happens at the end of the story? Abraham has to put right the mess he's made again. He prays for those who have been impacted by this scheme. And if you notice, it's not up there, in your chapters, the thing that they're like having to be healed from is barrenness. And so all of King Abimelech's household became barren as soon as Sarai entered his household. And it's Abraham that has to pray for them. He is the one who has to pray for the ones impacted by his scheme. And the God tells the king that Abraham will pray, and he does. And the wombs of those he's caused to be closed by his scheming were opened. And then directly after that, we get chapter 21. The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the right time, at just the time that God had said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac, and then you jump down. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. Isaac literally means he laughs. All who hear about this will laugh with me. And then there's this line. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given him a son in his old age. I don't know, Sarah. Who would have said to Abraham? God himself appeared to him, right? Like this thing of like, so I feel like when you look at these characters, these real people in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we should all go, oh, it's not just me. Okay. Sarah, who would have said that? I think it was a promise directly given to your husband multiple times, right? And then, unfortunately, the last time we see Sarah, she sees Ishmael mocking her son Isaac. She demands that Abraham send him and Hagar away because she doesn't want him sharing Isaac's inheritance. So again, this self-preservation. But God protects Hagar in the wilderness. And God hears Ishmael crying. And it's a beautiful story, so I'm going to encourage you to go back and read this whole section through. And there's 30 sessions on Bible Classroom that, they're half an hour each. You can do those as well. They're great. But God hears Ishmael crying. 2 brothers, right? 1 chosen. But unlike Cain and Abel, it's the injustice to the non-chosen son here that God hears through his crying in the wilderness. And because God is merciful, he steps in to protect the victims of injustice, even the ones who are outsiders. And then in chapter 23, we learn that Sarah died at the age of 27. And as we look at our case board, we don't really see faith jumping off the page. We don't see hail bowl moments. In fact, we see a woman who has gone through incredible adversity, traumatic experiences, a hurt woman who hurts others. We see a victim of self-preservation, and we see someone who victimizes others out of self-preservation. So why is she here in chapter 11? She's clearly faithful to her husband, but the whole reason is that she considered him faithful who had promised. The one that kept her safe, the one that didn't reject her when she failed, the one who didn't smite her when she laughed at his promise. And somewhere between laughing and the birth of Isaac, Sarah considered him faithful, the one who had promised. Was it her experience of being protected from the kings? Was it seeing all these wombs being opened when Abraham prayed for King Abimelech's family? Somewhere along the way, this woman, past her childbearing age, weighed the evidence, stepped out in faith, and this was a little hail bowl moment. She had to do what you have to do to get pregnant, right? And God blesses her with he laughs with Isaac. Through this flawed and failing woman and man, God promises that all the families of the world will be blessed. And we are those families. We see in Genesis 1 through 11, God's relationship and his blessing is with God and humanity. And then we see that covenant that he makes with Abraham and ultimately Israel. And then when Jesus comes, that blessing opens up to everyone once again. We are those families. And throughout many of our childhoods, the Sunday school classes that we had would teach these stories, and they would take these Old Testament characters and they'd make them into heroes, right? There'd be some sort of like moral thing to hold on to. These stories are not included so that we exalt these people. It's to turn our eyes to Jesus, to see that he was always kind and merciful. He's a God that blesses, not because we deserve it, because that is who he is. The God's chosen ones, no matter how many hail bowl moments or considered faith they have, would never be the perfect chosen one. This cycle of creation and escalating failures and decreation and recreation with this remnant of humanity was a song leading us to the one who would come, lead a perfect life with no series of failures, who would die and in his resurrection would bring new humanity, where we're invited to stop our scheming and trust him. By his Spirit, that cycle, that melody becomes unchained. We're no longer slaves to escalating failures, and we have the freedom by his Spirit to say no to sin. The curse of sin and death is broken. So, what do we do with these snapshots that we have of Sarah's life? Well, the first one, is anything too hard for the Lord? And so whatever situations you're walking through right now, I just want you to say this statement over them. That was a quick point. The next one, this happened at just the time God had said it would. Hindsight is amazing. But it's critical that we, like Sarah, look back at her life, but look back at our own lives and see that God is faithful. In Sarah's situation, both her and her husband's scheming didn't derail the blessing of God. His purpose and his plan for them still came to fruition. But gosh, it would have been a lot less heartache and drama if they would have just trusted God to bring things about. How often do we do the same thing? This isn't happening quite fast enough. Maybe I need to help God along. Refer back to our first takeaway. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Does he need your help? No. But he wants your participation. You will not derail the purposes, but your scheme can definitely add some drama and heartache to your life and to those around you. Thirdly, weighing the evidence is not lack of faith. In fact, it should build faith. Questions are okay. Sarah is included in this list because she considered and she trusted. Faith is not the absence of things, not of thinking things through. Faith is not the absence of thinking things through. It actually begins with that process. And sometimes we have to think about, what is our idea when we hear the word faith? Do we just think, it's blind faith, right? But that's not what Hebrews is conveying here. These are people who considered, and even when you think about Noah and Abraham, they knew who the Lord was, right? God appeared to Abraham multiple times. So faith is what you have when there is good reason to believe that God is going to do what he said he's going to do. Tim Mackey said, to believe in something when there is no good evidence, no shred of reason or evidence, that's not faith, that's stupidity. Why would you believe it? It doesn't make any sense at all. And the reason that we spend so much time here at Hope, going through the Word, right, looking at who God is, what his character is like, looking at the Old Testament and the New Testament, sharing testimony together, is because there is evidence to build our faith upon. There is loads of evidence. And the one thing that I love is the more I dig into this, the more evidence I find. So there's not a point where I go, oh, Genesis, I think I'm done now. Like, there's so much there. Like, it is incredible. Some of us did the Bible classroom of, like, the Old Testament, the intro to the Old Testament. Where's Ricky and Louise? Downstairs. I think both of them, because they were like new believers doing this, right? And they were like, I think we got 10% of it. And I was like, you have 10% more than I had. Like, as in, at your age, I didn't, and when I was a believer of your age, I didn't have that much. Like, it's just, there's so much there. So I can encourage you that actually 10% is great. And it just opens your eyes. And even if you don't take it all in, what you go is like, wow, there's a lot there. And it's just so incredible. Okay, so what do we do with all this evidence? Well, Hebrews 12 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to live the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects your faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and now he is seated in the place of honor. Let us strip off every weight. This morning, if the Holy Spirit is revealing to you your involvement in scheming, or where you're lacking trust that nothing is too hard for the Lord, ask him to get your eyes on Jesus, who went to the cross for you, not because you deserved it, but because he chooses you out of his grace and his love. And for some of you, maybe you need to see the consequences of your scheming. But just remember, a faithful father disciplines his children. He doesn't take away consequences, so he won't undo, but what he will do is take that and turn it into blessing. Because he's so good like that. So can you meet with him? Ask him to fill you. His power at work with you gives you the power to return to Eden, but not for that fall cycle, but for that right relationship with him. And maybe, like me, you're holding on to that idea that blessing is something that God didn't promise, that it's stuff. Or maybe it's something else in your mind that you're like, that's what blessing looks like, and he's holding out on me. He's the one preventing me to have that child, like Sarah said. God's not withholding, and you don't need to scheme or self-preserve. You don't need to fear that your son's going to miss out on that inheritance and then do something in order to hurt someone else. Can we learn from Sarah and ask God, what is it that you have blessed me with? And kind of pull back from the focus and look at the wider blessing that he has for you. So we have the blessing of knowing that God did indeed send the perfect chosen one, and he is seated in the place of honor. And he's worthy of all praise and adoration. And so, band, if you come up, we're going to praise him. And we're going to spend some time remembering that actually he is the perfect one. He's good all the time.